Another CEO Wisdom Pod with Dom Fendius. He is founder and CEO at Kiirsh. We're going to talk about scouting, advising, CEOship, foundership, everything in between. Dom's from London. So we had an interesting pre-call about that. Dom, can you say a little hello, introduce yourself, and tell us what you're working on nowadays?
Of course, yeah. Thanks for having me, first of all. My name is Dom Fendius. I've been in the tech startup space for the last 15, 16 years, mainly as a CEO and founder doing e-commerce, retail tech. But also over that time, I've been doing some advisory stuff, and that spans a whole range of different startups. So not purely focused on any one sector. And I know we're going to get into this in more detail, but as part of that advisory stuff, I've advised a few angel syndicates. I was the EIR at WeWork Labs, which was the internal accelerator within WeWork, which was a really fun and exciting time, very interesting. And currently working on a new startup, which is called Kiirsh, and we do supply chain stuff for consumer brands, but we'll get into that in more detail. And separately to that, I should say as well, also a scout for Ada Ventures, which is a VC fund in London, and an investor with Her Mesa, which is an angel syndicate in London as well.
Right. So I was wrong about saying that your first startup was in 2008, was actually in 2003, DTF Publishing. So you've always alternated kind of between startups and let's say paid or salary roles. Is that a good assumption? And yeah, try to summarize your career, the last 20 years of your life career-wise. What's been your strategy, and how and if you have reached the goals you've set for yourself?
Yeah. So, I studied business in German at university, and immediately I left. I wanted to start my own business, and I didn't have any kind of grand strategy or thought at that point about how to attack the space. I just thought I want to get out there and get my hands dirty and my feet wet. And I think probably at that time quite naive. I obviously studied a lot of successful businesses at university. I'd read a lot of business books, and I thought it was going to be really easy, right? And so that first business, DTF Publishing, I'd spent a year studying in Berlin during my degree, and there was a free magazine that was really popular in Berlin. So I thought, right, I'm going to launch something similar in London, but also make it, digital and online version as well. And at that time, that would have been 2003. The internet was a pretty new thing. It was not, free magazines were still a thing, right? Which sounds kind of insane now. Well, I mean, magazines still exist, but they're not considered good businesses anymore. So yeah, I did that for a couple of years, but it was not very successful, but it taught me a lot, right?
So
And
these were the
it was exciting.
Felix Dennis days.
Oh, Felix Dennis. I mean,
He's a legend.
he's a legend. And that book, I read that book, and yeah, for sure, that was inspirational. Because he was also a maverick, right? And I think most founders you meet have that kind of maverick spirit, and they're excited about breaking the rules, doing something interesting. And he actually, where I'm from in the UK, is a place called Warwickshire, which is just sort of north of London, near Oxford. And Felix Dennis actually had a property there. And I don't know if you remember this, if you read his book or if you know anything about him, but he planted a lot of trees. And that was a big passion of his. And I think he was based in Stratford, which famously, or just outside, which is where Shakespeare is from. And had a huge forest that he planted there. But yeah, that book just blew my mind. And some of it is a bit ridiculous as well. He would say, I think if you remember, there's a bit where he says, oh yeah, if you've got between £5 to £10 million, you're comfortably poor. I mean, I got what he was saying, right? But it's also a bit ridiculous. And I think that can happen to people when they get a lot of money. They kind of come out with, they forget that 5 to 10 million is a lot of money. It doesn't matter who you are, right?
Yeah, he's such
But
a
yes,
an extremist, like a serotonin fiend, I would say. And I was about to say that he planted one tree per woman he had. That could be logic, somewhat logic. And what an interesting man, though.
yeah,
It's funny because I mean, the wealth thing apart, the wealth is important in life if you want to make change. He donated some of it, but in his case, he could have survived off, let's say, 5K euro per year and write poetry from day one. So people, they go and amass and it is respectable because they want to know how it feels to be
mm,
wealthy. But I also think that he had his up and down with this kind of lifestyle. He
yeah,
somewhat quickly discovered that it wasn't scalable. It was just like up and downs, and there was very few recovery time between each. But fascinating man, nonetheless.
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and that's it's really interesting you mentioned him actually, because those were the kind of books that I was reading and just got me pumped up and from a very early stage. My father was an entrepreneur as well, so I just knew it's what I wanted to do, right? Um, but yeah, so after that first business, it didn't really work out, and also my father became very ill at that time and died. So I thought, right, I need some stability in my life. I need to make some money, and I also need to learn, about weirdly, I thought I needed to learn about finance because I realized how important having capital was to getting your business up and running if you want to build a big business, right? So that was I maybe the biggest lesson I took away from that first business. Is that you really can't do anything without access to capital. And by the way, I should have learned loads more lessons, which I didn't learn from that first failure. But that's life, right? You're young and naive. So I got a job at a family office, and I thought I was going to be doing startup stuff. But I don't know if you and your viewers and listeners know much about family offices, but essentially, I mean, they can vary quite wildly as to how they operate and how they're managed. But um, this was a relatively small one, and they'd essentially the son was allocated a certain portion of the money and could choose what kind of investments to make. But they'd made their money in real estate. So what ended up happening was I just focused on real estate. And because I studied for a bit in Berlin and I'd done German as part of my degree, I started analyzing real estate in Berlin. So I didn't really do any startups. Um, but it was quite fun nonetheless. And I quite enjoyed doing it. But after a while, I got the opportunity to move on to Goldman Sachs. So I did that. And I was in the investment banking division there. And I've got to say, that had almost zero. Um, what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't really useful in terms of teaching me anything about venture financing for startups, but it was really useful for two main reasons. Number one, the work ethic. And I think I had a pretty good work ethic anyway. But as you can imagine, at Goldman, particularly pre financial crisis, work ethic was insane, right? I mean, I'd say a funny story actually. Um, in one of my first weeks there, the boss on my team was like, right, Tom, are we going to see you on Saturday morning? We need some help. And I knew I had no choice really, but I sort of was like, And he goes, come on, Dom, this isn't Morgan Stanley, this is Goldman Sachs. I'll see you on Saturday morning. And so that was the kind of atmosphere that you expected to work hard. And yeah,
Was there
that
like
is
testosterone as well, and the Wall Street type of vibe with people calling and shouting and insulting one another?
there's definitely a bit of that, but because I think that was probably more so on the equity side of the business, where you have the trading floor, and I have friends who did that, and it strikes me that that was more of an aggressive environment. The IBD side, people are heads down working on, pitch books, getting deals done, and it's very kind of academic work. Whereas, on the equity side, particularly if it's trading, it's just the market's open and then boom, you full speed for the hours that the market are open. So it wasn't too bad. Uh, and I didn't. I mean, I went to boarding school, so I know about testosterone fueled environments, and I grew up with an older brother. So, it wasn't really bad in that regard. Um, but I didn't enjoy it that much because I liked maybe two people on my team, and it wasn't that I strongly disliked the other people, but it was, I found the tasks very monotonous. They were challenging in the sense that it was a lot of work, but it wasn't particularly stimulating. Uh, and yeah, you were learning, but it was in a very narrow field. And I didn't think that really applied to what I wanted to do long term. Um, and the second thing which I got, which I mentioned, there were two things. The second thing which I came away from Goldman with was having Goldman on the CV, which is just insanely valuable because absent of any other kind of factors about you, if people don't know anything about you, they look and they see Goldman and they make an assumption that you must be smart. And, you know, uh, I'll happily take that, right? I'm not super smart. I was obviously smart enough to do a degree and get in there, fine. But it helps you because people take you seriously. And it's the same. And actually, this translates into what I advise founders when they are trying to raise investment. You need to be able to give your investors tangible things to hold on to, some kind of social proof. If someone they respect has done the work before of vetting you, and that could be a warm intro, right? But it could also be that you've worked at a blue chip organization. If you're from Google or Meta, or back in the old days when they were not so big, Goldman or McKinsey, then that's just makes things a little bit easier for you, right? And sometimes a lot easier for you. It just makes you, more serious. And that's really important when you're doing pre-seed, like pre-revenue fundraising, because there's very, very little. And if you don't have a track record of multiple billion-pound exits, then you need all of that help you can get. So yeah, that was the finance days for a few years. And post that, I decided to start I would say my first proper tech startup, which was a business called Stitch. And the idea was when I was at university, there used to be these websites where they post pictures of nightclub events, right? And we'd all go on and see if we were in the pictures. But also, I used to look at those and go, okay, that's a style inspiration. If I want to buy some clothes, I want to see, who's dressed well, and then I'll buy something that I think looks good based on those photos. And I thought, well, what if we just made a website where you could buy the the clothes in those images, and you wouldn't believe it, but that would have been 2007. So this was pre-iPhone, pre-Instagram. No one was doing that, and we did it on the desktop, so it was quite a sort of clunky. It was not a super smooth experience, but it was nonetheless. You know how it works on Instagram now. You touch a picture and information will pop up, and you can click through and buy it. it was effectively that. And we thought, great, we're onto something here, and we've got loads of good press coverage. We've got a lot of users. But the thing is, it didn't really work because of the unit economics. So what would happen is it was typically aimed at very young people, right? So the clothes they were wearing were, I don't know, from places like, well, UK businesses like Topshop or ASOS, which I don't know if you're familiar with those, but like H&M, Zara, those sorts of things, right? So the average basket value was not huge. And then, you know, the affiliate fee wouldn't get much. So, yeah, after that, did another, a design-based e-commerce business, which was a mobile app. Again, you know, built it to a decent size, but did not grow to the huge business we wanted. So moved on to another one after that, which was super exciting technically. A business called App Apparel, and that was essentially wireless clothing labels that turned any piece of clothing into a wearable device. Super cool. Raised money from a VC fund in London. My co-founder was an American guy, XYC founder. And yeah, you know, we had some success, but again, didn't really build it to the huge size that we wanted. So that's when I then decided, okay, a bit of advisory work now. And yeah, managed to get a job at WeWork as the entrepreneur in residence for WeWork Labs. And yeah, that was just a crazy exciting time when Adam Newman was still the CEO. And yeah, I just used to love coming into the office. There was a real energy. And I know we talked about this previously, but Adam Newman, you know, and he gets a lot of criticism, but he really did something amazing, which has just made WeWork this place where you love to come in. And I know, you know, there'll be people who worked at WeWork who don't agree with that. But I'm talking more about the atmosphere of WeWork as a whole. I just felt this amazing feeling every day I walked into the office. This is where things are happening. And there are very few people, very few CEOs who can do something like that. So, you know, I know he gets his criticism, and I think some of it will definitely be fair. But for me, I think it also should be that kind of ability to build a culture is rare.
Right.
So
for the advisor roles, like it is like monthly payments, like they pay you 3K per month per advisory. Is that like how it goes?
It completely depends, right? If you're doing it at a super early stage, a lot of the company, and I was doing it at a quite early stage because I was working for an organization who were almost like an accelerator, and they hooked you up with pre-seed startups to get them ready for their first round of proper investment. So I would be paid by the organization. And then if the companies wanted to keep me on, they could, after the program finished, they could either pay me, or what quite often happened is they didn't have the funds yet, so they would say, okay, we'll make it up to you in equity. So it totally depended on each of the companies. But also
Okay.
sometimes I would just
Oh yeah, I was saying okay. Sometime you would.
sometimes I would do it for free if I thought the business was great, if I felt I was learning something, and if I liked the founders. And that happened more often than not, actually. You know, because I just love the startup scene, right? And you're working with some really exciting, interesting people who are mission driven. It's quite rewarding.
Yeah, for sure. And the Adam Newman thing, Well, first he took a really crappy industry and had a
Mm.
killer vision behind it. So if only he would have, like a good idea, work on
Yeah,
an actual good idea, an actual product market fit, not a shitty business model. Because real estate is really that crappy business model in which you have to wait 10, 20, 30 years uh, and wait for compound. I mean, it is a sure way to get somewhere, but it's not like the unicorn 0 to 1 in less than 5 years.
yeah, yeah,
It's literally the most physical thing, right? Real
yeah,
estate. In French, it's called immobilier, right? Because it's
yeah.
not mobile. It stays,
Right.
it's stable. It doesn't fucking move. Um,
Yeah,
while apps and startups and unicorns are the complete opposite. They are super fluid. They can move fast. They can break things. So yeah, Adam, wartime CEO. Like I'd want this guy at the head of my business if I was going through war, and his vision is quite incredible. Did you actually get to talk to the guy?
no, no, never. Um, I mean, had an event in London once where Miguel, his co-founder, uh, came and talked to us. That was, that was the closest I ever got to, because it was such a big team at that stage. It was really it was pre-IPO and pre his ousting when I
Right.
was, you know,
And
when I was
EIR is
involved.
like coming up with business ideas that can be applied, right?
No, so well, I mean, it depends where you are, right? In a venture fund, that would be what the EIR is doing. In WeWork Labs, it was very much helping the startups who were part of the incubator program, the accelerator program at WeWork Labs.
Okay.
So I was really doing an advisory role for startups.
Okay.
Um, yeah, but also kind of working on my own ideas at the same time.
Right. Last question, like the scouting part of things. Can you describe your scout role and how you get in touch with as many startup founders as possible and how you find out which one is the best to invest?
Yeah, so I'm a scout at Ada Ventures, which is a London-based pre-seed seed fund, about $100 million in managing $100 million at the moment, something like that. So relatively small. Average check size, I guess, is between 250 and £1.5 million. Um, and they like to be the first money in. And as a scout, the idea is that we're finding companies they wouldn't necessarily be able to find. So underserved founders in underserved sectors is the way they describe it. Um, and it's becoming a more common thing. Um, but they were one of the first to do it in London. And it essentially works, we're kind of almost like an early part of their team, although we're very much not part of the team, right? We're external to the team. Um, but yeah, we get a cash reward if we send them a company they end up investing in. And then you can also get carry in the deal itself. Um, in terms of how I go about it, I so I started doing it when I was the EIR at WeWork. So the idea was I was in this environment where there are loads of startups. So it was more a case of, seeing what crossed my desk rather than actively going out. But some of the scouts will do that. They'll actively go out and, try and hunt down. And some of these people who are scouts are doing it because they want to become a VC long term. And it's a great way of learning it. Um, but a lot of the scouts as well are outside of London because in the UK, the startup scene is very much London centric. So Ada believe that they're missing out, or if you don't look outside of London, you're missing out on a lot of potentially great businesses. And that's the idea behind the Scout program. And I think a third of the businesses in Fund One were Scout businesses. And they're doing pretty well so far. Um, so yeah, it's quite an exciting way of doing it. And I think, it's leading to, because the scouts are a broad range of ages, but some of them are university students. So they're very young, right? And it just gives these VCs a fresh perspective, because typically the VCs in London are a certain type of person, right? So,
Dom, thank you for sharing the value today. Where can people find out more about you?
yeah, so my socials are at Dom Fendius. Twitter's probably the best one. I don't tweet a lot, but if you go there, you get a good sense of who I am. And yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, Dom Fendius. So yeah.
Thank you so much.